Hi, welcome. My name's Amy MacDonald. I run this joint, and it's killing me. How many people? This is your first time here? Okay, more and more people are. It's not your first time. Come back. Check us out. Check out our website, wbur.org/events. I like to call it the 92nd Street Y of Boston because we do everything. We not only have these wonderful conversations, we have author interviews, we have cooking, we have moth storytelling, we have hip hop, we have an opera. There's something for everybody, so come back. We are so proud to have Andrea Bernstein here tonight. She has Trump Inc. is her podcast out of WNYC. She is an award-winning journalist. She's won a Peabody. She's won a DuPont Columbia. She has been investigating the Trump administration and family for years and has broken key stories about money laundering, about fraudulent business practices. Her thoroughness, her tenacity, her smarts make her one of the best investigative journalists in this country. And I feel American Oligarchs is a gift to us, the little people, and teach us about what's going on in this country. Interviewing her tonight is Tonya Mosley. Tonya was recently named the third host of Here and Now. Tonya is also an award-winning journalist. She's based in LA. She flew out to do this for us tonight. And her podcast is Truth Be Told. Do I have it correct? Please welcome Andrea and Tonya.
I'd like to thank all of you all for coming here tonight. And of course, the impeachment trial is happening as we speak. And really, there is no one better to have on stage to talk with us about her book and also to answer your questions about the subject that we're talking about tonight, but also the impeachment trial itself. So this is a conversation between Andrea and I, but it's also a conversation with you. So know that whatever questions you have as we move through the night, I want you to keep them in your mind, and you will be able to ask Andrea all of them. Well, you say that this book offers in great detail how the Trump and Kushner families profited from a system of corruption, influence, and dark money, which of course has resulted in Donald J. Trump being the president of our country, and Jared Kushner, now one of the most powerful men in America. I want to explore this thesis with you based on your extensive research. You and I were talking about you have more than 30 pages at the end of the book of references.
Very fine print.
And very fine print as well, smaller print than the rest of the book. And the best way to get into this story is exactly how you laid out the book, which is from the beginning, and the immigrant roots for both Kushner and Donald Trump. And let's start with Kushner.
All right, so let me just say thank you, Amy, and really thank you, everybody, for coming out on this rather cool evening. Maybe not cool for Boston, but and
definitely
also I
cool
know
for
there's
LA.
a lot going on in the world. So thank you for coming. So the story that I wanted to write, and I really wanted to write a book to be read, and not just because people felt like they had to read it to know things. So I wanted to tell the story of these two families, and also a story about democracy and how democracy got to this point, but telling it through the story of these two families. So I went in deep with the origin stories of both families, and the Kushner family origin story is much less well known, but this is a family of Holocaust survivors who were almost killed, murdered on so many occasions. It's amazing that they ever got out of Nazi-occupied Poland and into America. And the Trump family story, which was a little bit of a different story, but was also a story, an immigrant story of immigrant hustling and sort of getting here and coming to a country where at that time you could still make something of yourself. You could change your social class because of the economic conditions in the country at that time. And one of the things that I write about in the book is how that has changed so much, so that the conditions that enabled these families to thrive are now not available to many people who are arriving or just being born in America today.
Yes, let's break down the Kushner story. As you mentioned, his grandparents were Holocaust survivors. They met when they were in Poland. They were married. They moved through, spent a few years in a refugee camp, and then came to the United States. And they hid their nationality and also their relation to each other, which is also something that often happens as folks are coming through to the country. But they made their way to the United States, and Kushner's grandfather then begins to build his family fortune. Take the story from there.
So let me just back up a little bit to the sort of Holocaust years, because, I mean, one of the things that was happening in the world during the Holocaust was there was this tremendous forces of destruction, which sort of paradoxically led to a more equal society. So the Kushner family, Jared Kushner's grandmother, they had been furriers. They'd been sort of comfortably middle class, upper middle class, living in a sort of merchant town in northeast Poland. Mm-hmm. When the Nazis came, they lost everything, all of their documents, everything they owned. And Jared Kushner's grandmother and grandfather met during the war, and then after the war they got married in Budapest as they were fleeing Soviet-occupied Poland. And they end up in a refugee camp in Italy, and they can't get out. There are quotas in the US. The laws, the immigration laws are very anti-Semitic, even after the Holocaust. So they come up with the idea that they're going to change their names and change their family relationships. So Jared Kushner's grandfather, he was born Yussel Berkowitz. He took on the name Kushner, which was his wife's name, and presented himself as the son of his father-in-law. Mm-hmm. And they presented themselves as a family from Germany because immigration laws favored Germany, and were able to immigrate to the U.S. with $2 in their pockets when they arrived on the shores. And they had actually put down the name of a sponsor on their immigration paperwork, but a group named the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society reached out to the sponsor, and while they were en route on a boat from Italy to New York, the sponsor said, I don't know who these people are. I'm not taking responsibility for them. So they arrived in New York with nothing, no sponsor, $2, and Hayes took them in and helped them find shelter and helped them find jobs. And Joe Kushner, Jared Kushner's grandfather, had worked as a carpenter. Now, he was from a really poor town. So Jared Kushner's grandmother was more sort of middle, maybe upper middle class. His grandfather was sort of like fiddler on the roof, from a real shtetl, really poor. But he had these skills as a carpenter. And when he came to New York in this post-war period, those skills were so much in demand because GIs were returning, people needed housing. There was this incredible housing shortage, and there was all of this government money going into home building in various ways. So there was loan assistance, there was tax assistance, and there was the Federal Interstate Highway Act, which built roads that enabled people to get to all these suburban homes. And this was the sort of tremendous wave that the Kushner family rode to go from $2 to being, by the time he died, a millionaire many times over.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk a little bit about Jared Kushner as it relates to his origin story, because I think when we hear this story, when we hear the details, it's really hard for people to reconcile where Jared
and for
Kushner
me too.
is. Yes.
And I thought about it a lot.
Yeah, I want to talk more in detail about that. But I want you to also then lay the groundwork for us on Trump's immigrant roots. His grandfather, Friedrich Trump, immigrated to the U.S. from Germany, although that's not where he told people he was from.
So this was Donald Trump's father, Fred, who changed where he was from the
not Friedrich.
Friedrich came from Germany. So there were a couple things going on in Germany at the time. He came around the end of the 1800s, and there had been a long war going on in Germany, and he didn't want to join the military. And also, because he wasn't the first son in his family, he wasn't going to get any inheritance. Mm-hmm. So he takes a boat to New York, and he arrives in New York, and he works as a barber for a little while. But then basically what he does is he goes west.
To Seattle.
And he goes to Seattle, and then he goes to the Yukon, where it's the last gold rush. While he's living in Seattle running a business, a ship comes in with all of these gold nuggets from the Yukon, and everybody believes, yes, they too can be able to get rich. And there are people that are crossing the mountains, and they're carrying with them 1,000 pounds of goods, and they're going through mosquitoes, and they're eating horse meat, but they believe that they will find gold. And what Donald Trump's grandfather does is he is not a prospector. He's in the hospitality business. So he sets up an establishment where there's going to be a lot of prospectors, where he's going to get a lot of customers. And he sells liquor, and he sells food, and he sells access to sex. And a lot of people lose money in the gold rush, but Friedrich Trump doesn't. He builds up a nest egg because he's in this adjacent business. And then he goes back to New York with this nest egg, and he invests it in real estate in Queens, New York, just as the government is about to build infrastructure, which is going to enable people to get directly from Manhattan to Queens. So the land value is about to shoot up just at the time that Friedrich Trump buys it.
So both of these families, the Kushners and the Trumps, they both benefited greatly in these times from the New Deal and really institutional racism.
They did. I mean, they really did, each in their own ways. So what was happening with the Kushner family is the suburbanization of America and white flight. Mm-hmm. And as whites were being really encouraged to leave cities by these federal programs, which made it so cheap to buy housing because you could get a tax break, you could get a loan, and also you could drive your car on these new highways. So they really were benefiting from that. The Trump family benefited also from racism in a slightly different way. They also lived sort of out at the end of the subway line in New York in these white ethnic enclaves. But the Justice Department charged the Trump family with actively excluding black families. Right. And they fought it. By this time, Donald Trump was already in the business. But they ended up, essentially, the Justice Department said, you cannot do this anymore. And they said, okay. So they were never exonerated. There were a lot of court records showing that they had these racist practices. But they agreed never to do it again. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that that is not a promise that the Trump family kept.
I love doing these and hearing the reactions of the audience. You know, when you're in a studio, you don't get to hear this. But I imagine this is what's happening in your cars when you're hearing this on the radio.
We never, no one ever talks back to us. So. Yeah.
Both of these families were ambitious and very much social climbers, to say the least. And both families, especially the Trumps, gave money to local and state political campaigns pretty aggressively. So I'm thinking about Trump's father and then Trump, but also the Kushners as well. But it goes much deeper than that, because they were doing this very intentionally with the idea that kind of in many ways, I scratch your back, you scratch mine when I need you to.
Right, and I think one of the things that was really interesting to me is, so I've covered corruption in New York government for a long time. And one of the interesting things to me as I got into the story of Donald Trump is I had always, New York real estate is a shady business. So real estate in New York is a highly valuable commodity, and people want it, and also it's controlled by government. So if you want an abatement or you want a zoning regulation to go in your favor, you need to have connections. But one of the things that was quite striking to me is the extent to which the Trump family were outliers. And that
in what ways?
In a couple of ways. So one of the ways was that people in the real estate community that I would meet with, other big developers, would say to me, okay, they're not one of us. They all wanted me to know that. That was the first thing that when I sat down with them, they would say they're not one of us. They're not involved in civic life. They're not involved in the social organizations that sort of promote New York City, like the Association for a Better New York. But also, going through years of investigations and court records, what I learned was that Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, and then Donald Trump gave so much money to the system, and in a way where they just expected something in a direct transactional way. So here's an example. Many times I've called real estate developers and I said, why did you make a contribution to politician so-and-so? Andrew Cuomo, George Pataki, various governors, not Michael Bloomberg because he didn't take any money, but mayors before and since. And people would would say, well, they control what they're doing. We have to make nice. If they call us, we don't want to cross them. With Trump, totally different. I would call people and I'd say, do you know why he gave his contribution? Oh, yes. Donald Trump had called to scream at people and say, I gave you $20,000. Where is my permit? So it was a very different kind of relationship, that there was a real sense that he was giving something and that he expected to get something back from his political contributions. Sounds familiar, right? Quid pro quo, I believe is what it's called.
There were many instances of that.
Now, he didn't always get it.
Yes.
But he believed that he was entitled to it.
Right. You actually have very specific stories about that within the book. But there was also stories about tax evasion.
Yeah.
Very much so, which were likely, I'm guessing for you as a reporter, harder to track, but also took a deep amount of reporting from both the Kushner families and the Trump families very aggressively.
Right. Well, Jared Kushner's father actually went to prison for tax evasion. So there was a big court file to look to. And one of the things that I learned in the course of reporting this book, and also in working for Trump Inc. on the podcast that we work on, is that most people don't read things. So you get an automatic big bonus by just reading a court file from beginning to end. And for example, not in the book, but one of the interesting things that I learned was that by reading to page 394 Fiona Hill's testimony, was that one of the prosecutors that Rudy Giuliani met with was so corrupt that U.S. officials had put a wiretap on his fish tank to eavesdrop on him about a corrupt scheme. So anyway, I tried to read things to the end. But just by reading this court file, which people knew, I mean, obviously it's not an unknown fact that Jared Kushner's father went to prison, but just by getting into the court file, I really understood the structure of the tax evasion scheme, which was also it was tax evasion and tax avoidance. So here's one Boston story, which is that many of you may know that Jared Kushner went to Harvard, and that came about after an exceedingly large, many hundreds of thousands contributions by Charlie Kushner to Harvard. Charlie Kushner did not go to Harvard. He went to Hofstra and NYU, which are very fine institutions, but they're not Harvard. And he had given this giant contribution, and Jared did indeed get into Harvard. But the thing about making such a contribution is that it is tax deductible. So he is able to increase the social status and position of his son, Jared Kushner, while also getting a tax contribution, which is one of the ways that our tax system favors oligarchic behavior, which I talk about a lot in the book.
Both families also inflated their wealth to maybe perhaps Trump in a much larger extent. You write that the Kushners presented outsized assets, and this was a playbook for Donald Trump as well, all through the 90s and the 2000s. Why does this make them distinct? We often know that very wealthy people perhaps inflate their wealth and also hide their wealth.
It's a complicated thing because there is definitely a continuum, but one of the things that we see with the Trump family through the generations is that their property is valued situationally. So there's this Senate Banking Committee first investigated the Trump family, which was the first U.S. congressional investigation of the Trump family that I know about, in 1954. And they brought in Fred Trump, who had gotten many of these loans, many of these Federal Housing Administration loans. And at the time, the Federal Housing Administrator locally was really controlled by the Brooklyn Democratic Party. So Fred Trump made sure to cultivate those ties. He gave a lot of money, and he got a very large portion of these loans. And one of the things about these loans is they were in limited supply. So if Fred Trump was getting a lot of them, somebody else was not getting a lot of them. So they said to him, why are you valuing your properties so high? But when the tax man cometh, your $2 million property is worth $180,000. And it is something that we see all through the Trump family from generation to generation. The way they value their properties high when it benefits them and low, to the extent that the New York Times called it outright fraud. So it's not just a normal real estate model, it is outside of the bounds of that, and I think that is one of the important lessons of looking at the Trump family's business practices.
Yeah. And talking about those in the real estate world in New York and them saying that Trump is definitely not one of them, it seems that especially early on, you actually write about this, that Trump dealt with criminals or soon-to-be criminals. He sold property to them, apartments to them.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
How did that play into Trump's business dealings throughout the 80s and the 2000s?
So when Trump built Trump Tower, one of the things that was interesting about it was that this was a time in American history where there's you were allowed to set up limited liability companies, which are companies where you don't really have to declare your ownership. And this was just sort of coming into being around the time Trump Tower was being built. And it turns out that 3/4 of the people that were moving into Trump Tower when Trump Tower was built were people that were sort of using this vehicle to obscure who they were or where their money was coming from. And when you look at a lot of the people in Trump Tower, a lot of them were people who had taken money from various money laundering schemes and used them to buy their condos, or people who were under federal indictment, or people who were indicted while they were living there and then went to prison and then moved back there. And then we know Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's campaign manager, lived in Trump Tower. I mean, this just went on and on and on. And it is a family practice to not scrutinize your business partners and to really sort of be willing to do business with anybody. And we see it in New York, and we see it all around the world, where a Trump business partner has no experience, has been charged with tax evasion, has been charged with money laundering, or has some other kind of scrutiny, which many experts say under a sort of standard U.S. business practice, you would vet that, but not the Trumps.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I, as I was reading your book, I was thinking, we've all seen firsthand how the president bends the truth. And he will say, I mean,
30 lies a day.
That's what you found.
That's what the Washington Post has documented.
Yes.
I think we're up to 16,000 now in the last 3 years, and this is just as of this week.
And I think we all know that now. But one thing that really struck me in reading your book is just how this is almost a family trait.
Yeah. Well, this goes to the Swedish thing.
Yes. So, yes, his father, Fred.
Right. So during the war, World War II, it was not... So Fred Trump had really grown up in a German enclave and, in fact, spoke with a German accent. And he, during the war, was building a lot of housing in Norfolk, Virginia, and felt it was very bad business sense to say he was of German descent, so he started to say he was Swedish. Mm-hmm. And Donald Trump said many, many, many times over and over again that he was Swedish. And when his father, Fred Trump, was eulogized, it was said he was Swedish. There was a number of other sort of series of things that seem inconsequential, but are perhaps less inconsequential than they seem. So Donald Trump said he graduated summa cum laude from the Wharton School. He had not graduated with any honors. Ivanka Trump said on her book bio that she had graduated summa cum laude when she had not graduated summa cum laude. So there was definitely a sense in the Trump family that truth is fungible, and the truth is something that serves your business. So if a story serves your business, you're going to adopt it. Now, I have an example of this from today, which is that some of you may know that the Attorney General in the District of Columbia charged the Trump family with self-dealing regarding the Trump Hotel. That's right. Which was actually based on reporting that my Trump Inc. colleagues did, where they found that the inaugural committee had overpaid the Trump Hotel. And at the time, when my colleagues called up the Trump organization, the various individuals, they said, oh no, we were not involved in that. But it turns out from various emails and documents that were released by the DC AG today, they very much were involved in it. And in fact, not only were they involved in this scheme, but they were told by Rick Gates, people know who Rick Gates is, right? Paul Manafort's sidekick who's going to prison for money laundering and bank fraud. Anyway, Rick Gates went to Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump and said, "Don't do this, it's unethical." But according to the complaint today, they did it anyway. And then when my colleagues asked him about it, they said they hadn't when they had.
Yeah, yeah. You have a very thorough chapter about Ivanka Trump.
Yeah.
And in that, you also bring up her lies that also seem inconsequential, as you said. One was a story when she was
About the Legos?
about the Legos.
Yes.
Why was it important, though, that you
Right.
told this story in the book?
So the story about the Legos is that the chapter about Ivanka Trump starts with an interview that she does with Conan O'Brien about 2007-ish. And she's telling a story about how when she was young, maybe 6 years old, her brothers got Legos for Christmas and she got Barbies, and she was so angry that she stole her younger brother Eric's Legos and built a skyscraper out of Legos and glued them together with super glue from her mother Ivana's nails that she had for super gluing her nails, and that she had built such a beautiful structure that Donald Trump came to her and he said, you know, Trump Tower has 4 setbacks, not 5. But none of that happened. The story is actually written about by Donald Trump in The Art of the Deal, in which he wrote about he glued his brother Robert's blocks together into skyscrapers. So then I got in touch with the person who wrote The Art of a Deal, a gentleman named Tony Schwartz, and I said, did that happen? And he said, very little chance that actually happened. So this became a story that the Trump family told about themselves because they felt that it projected an image. And that, for the Trump family, and it's interesting because Ivanka Trump actually recognizes that she told this lie in her book, and she says, well, it didn't matter because what mattered was the story it told about our family. And to me, that was so interesting because I think that is very much the way the family operates. What matters is the story that you tell, not the truth of what happened. And a large part of what I have tried to do in this book is restore the idea that truth and facts are important and that they do matter.
Let's talk about Jared for a moment. Yes, you can clap for
Yeah, you can applaud for that.
You already talked about Jared's father, Charles, spending time in prison on 18 counts of illegal campaign contributions, tax evasion, and witness tampering. But I also want to talk with you a little bit about Jared and his trajectory. But I'll start with him purchasing the New York paper, the New York Observer. Over time, it became clear, as you write, that he started to bend towards conservatism, even though his family had been pretty liberal prior to.
Yeah, his family had been the largest Democratic donors in New Jersey at one point.
Yeah.
His father had given so much to the Democratic Party when a man named Jim McGreevey was running for governor and then was governor for a while before he resigned because he said, I am a gay American, and then he resigned, which sort of was the biggest sex scandal in the same week that Jared Kushner's father pleaded guilty and went to jail. So, but anyway, sort of backed into that story. But he was a very, very big Democratic donor. And there was a sense, New York is a Democratic town, largely. And there was a sense in this sort of cultural elite, people would tell me, oh, we thought Jared was one of us, sort of vaguely liberal. And he buys this paper, the New York Observer, where I actually worked, although before Jared Kushner bought the paper. And two things became very interesting about that. One was that he believed in using the paper in a very transactional way, and it really shocked a lot of the editors and the staff that worked there. So they felt, this is a place where we practice journalism. And he would come in and he said, I want to do a hit job on Chris Christie, who was the prosecutor who put his father in jail. Now, he says that didn't happen, but there's a lot of people at the paper who kept saying Jared wanted us to write a hit job on somebody, that he viewed this sort of paper in a political way.
And not just that. He would come in and say, how's it going? So how's the story going?
So there's a couple of stories where he went through various writers. He insisted that stories be written. Sometimes they weren't, sometimes they were. I mean, the editors really fought back for a time. But one of the things that, I mean, I talk about this, at some length in the book, because I think it's a very important sort of prelude to the way that journalism is viewed now in the White House. It's viewed as a tool to use for somebody. And it's a very, very, I mean, all presidents and all administrations want to cultivate friendly reporters and want to sort of maybe ice out unfriendly reporters. Believe me, I have been on the iced out end many times. So it's not a new thing, but I think what is very different is a sense that it's a tool. It's a tool to be used to carry out your aims, and it's fine. That's a fine thing, and that you sort of look at who is credentialed now. There's all kinds of sort of fringe newspapers. There's the One America Network. There are organizations that are not journalistic in the sense that you or I would understand, but that are credentialed to cover the president at the White House because they see the press as serving their ends.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Kushner's relationship with Rupert Murdoch? You have in the book that he was sort of thought of as an understudy in many ways.
Yeah, so the book, which I hope you all read.
You have to
I hope
read
you
it,
buy copies, 5 copies on your way out for all your friends. The book starts with a wedding of Jared and Ivanka, and which is this sort of incredible scene of these families coming together. But at that wedding, Rupert Murdoch and his then wife, Wendy Murdoch's children were the flower children at the wedding. They were very close. And there was a time when Jared Kushner and Ivanka had broken up because Ivanka wasn't Jewish and Jared comes from a more modern Orthodox Jewish family, and none of the parents were really happy about it. So they broke up for a while, and then it was the Murdochs who intervened and invite them separately for a weekend on their yacht, and they got back together, and then Ivanka Trump converted to Judaism and they got married. So the Murdochs play this pivotal role in their relationship. And also, Rupert Murdoch became a real mentor to Jared Kushner. And so Jared Kushner came into The Observer with this approach that The Observer was going to be used in this transactional way. And then he was really schooled by the way Rupert Murdoch used his paper. And he would come into the newsroom on a Monday and he would say to the reporters, okay, I was with Rupert, I was with Wendy on their yacht. And at first it was a social thing. And then it became clear that the ideas that he was adopting in the New York Observer editorial page were much more similar to Rupert Murdoch ideas that many of the people who thought he was vaguely liberal thought would be coming from Jared Kushner. So all of this was happening. There wasn't a discrete break when Jared Kushner joined the Trump campaign. There were many people in New York who thought there was, that he had just sort of walked out of his former self into something, but this was really somebody he was becoming over a long period of time.
Yeah. Which brings us to when Jared then made his way to the White House, and you have, you write in your book about how Jared's father gave him a gift for his new office in the White House, and it was a picture of his grandparents.
It's really interesting. Did anybody see that Jared Kushner did an interview with Time magazine? He was asked about the story, the immigration story. He was asked about my book and the story about how his grandparents had changed their relationships to get in the country, and how he felt that squared with his own immigration experience. His answer was basically, I'm never going to say anything bad about my father-in-law. But right there in the video, there's a picture of Joe and Ray, his Holocaust survivor grandparents, and he is given this picture by his father when he arrives in the White House and told, never forget who you are.
Mm-hmm. How do you think he reconciles that message from his father and his grandparents' experience to the role he plays today?
So I really, really thought a lot about this.
Yeah.
And at the time, so the first act starts with the story of Jared Kushner's grandmother's escape, which is this incredible story about how there had been tens of thousands of Jews in this area of Northeast Poland, and by the summer of 1943, there are 300. And they're in the ghetto, and they've been telling themselves, okay, we must be chosen. The Nazis must have selected for us to live because we haven't been killed yet. So it's going to be okay. We're going to hang on until the Soviets push back. But they come to realize, no, actually, if they stay, they're going to die. So they dig a tunnel underneath the fence, underneath the Nazi barbed wire, underneath the searchlights, and that's how they get out. And Jared Kushner, his grandmother, describes her experience in detail. And one of the things I did in working on the book was somebody said to me, well, is her story true? And I said, oh, well, wait, what? Holocaust survivors are not telling true stories? So I was like, okay, I need to know. I need to treat it journalistically like the way I treat any other story. So I listened to her sister's testimony, and I went to the Holocaust Research Center, and I asked them for every other oral testimony from the people who had been through this experience. And the story she told was corroborated widely. So I felt like, okay, yes, it's a true story. I'm going to put it in the book of how she got out of the Holocaust. But as I was writing this chapter and listening to all these testimonies, I kept thinking to myself about where we are today and the rise of the neo-Nazi movement and how disturbing it is, and how I can both see that there was this awful thing that happened in World War II, but then there was a sense of enlightenment after. And there was a sense, okay, we can do things to redirect our history. And understanding that moment and then seeing, okay, just 2 generations later, how it is back. And it's not only back in a general sense, it's back with the same people sort of enabling this certain kind of behavior. So I really, really, really kept wondering, how could that happen? I don't know that I understand it fully, but I will say that from the way, whenever Jared Kushner is asked about this, he sees his family as a success story. So when he talks about his grandparents, what he wants to talk about is how they came from nothing and how they built themselves up from nothing. And isn't it an amazing thing that their grandson is in the White House? Whenever he's asked about refugee or immigration policy, he just does not answer. He just shuts down and he just redirects the story. There are definitely things that I can trace from the family experience in the Holocaust. For example, there's a sense of defying authority, a sense of like anybody tells them what to do, no, bad. Jared Kushner's father feels very much that his siblings ganged up on him and cooperated with Chris Christie, the prosecutor, to put him in prison. And
do you want to tell them that
I will tell that story.
Because it's a pretty sordid story.
I will tell that story.
Yes, but let me
just finish the sentence, then I'll tell that story. So he said, what my brother and sister, my parents would forgive me for what I did, but they would never forgive my brother and sister for cooperating with the authorities and for collaborating with the government. So he viewed his siblings as collaborators. I'll tell you in a second what happened. But I think that what sort of developed was a sense of grievance and a sense of us versus them, and a sense of we survived the Nazis, so therefore we must protect ourselves. And the way that we are going to view that is we are going to build walls, we are going to keep people out who might harm us, and we are going to make sure that we diminish the power of our enemies before they can get us. So it's a perhaps different way of thinking from, I think, what was the general consensus after the Holocaust, which was that people had to rebuild the sense of social connection. They had to make a place for people in the world. They had to grapple with the problem of statelessness and also with the problem of moral relativism, which had developed. So I think that there's a sort of strain of kind of central, sort of liberal centrist thinking post-war. That was the response. But there is another response that I think is what the Kushner family has adopted. Now, Charlie Kushner's father, this is what happened with him. When he was becoming this Democratic donor, back to the tax evasion thing, he wasn't just paying out the money, writing a check. He was writing it from his companies, which you're not allowed to do because it's tax evasion. That is actually money that belongs to the people of the United States of America. So his brother, Murray, who is a lawyer, they had separate businesses, but Joe Kushner had set up a series of trusts, basically to avoid paying taxes, that connected the brothers in their businesses. So Murray objected to the way that Charlie was spending his money, and he sued Charlie. And the U.S. attorney, Chris Christie, got wind of this and began investigating, and they were doing a tax evasion case, which is a very hard case to do because you basically have to track different interlocking ledgers of limited liability companies. And Charlie Kushner fought back in the way that white-collar criminals frequently do, which is he hired a very high-powered lawyer that tried to make the case go away. They couldn't make the case go away. So Charlie Kushner took matters into his own hands, and he decides that he believes that his brother and his sister are collaborating against him and are conspiring to develop this criminal suit. So he hires a police captain to hire a sex worker to entrap his sister's husband. And that happens. And they meet at the Time to Eat diner in Bridgewater, New Jersey. And then she takes him to the Red Bull Motel, and they have an encounter which is videotaped. And then Charlie Kushner gets the videotape and hangs on to it for a while, but then he realizes that the criminal investigation is not getting dropped. And on the eve of his nephew's engagement party, he sends the videotape to his sister, who eventually ends up giving the video to Chris Christie, and Charlie Kushner is arrested for obstruction of justice and witness tampering and professes his innocence, but then ends up pleading guilty and serves a year in prison. So that is the story.
Yes. I have several other questions to ask you. I want you to start thinking about your questions, so we have enough time for that. But I want to take us to where we are today. You write in your book, soon after President Trump was elected and then inaugurated, he had to relinquish control over the Trump businesses to his sons, but did not divest control. And I'm just thinking about how all of this might perhaps lay the foundation. You actually write this, that the president cannot break the law. And it's something
Right.
that we're talking about at this very moment.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the whole idea of, so our very first episode of our Trump Inc. podcast was called A No Conflict Situation. And that is actually a quote from the president. When he was president-elect, he held a press conference. Some of you may remember of this, and he stood next to this pile of manila folders that we actually think were just empty folders. And he said, I've signed all these papers, and I'm turning them over control to my sons, but I have a no conflict situation as president, so I am not going to give up control of my company, ownership. Basically, he still profits to this day from his company. And this has put us really in an unprecedented situation because we don't know at any moment whose interest he is acting in, the people's interest or the company's interest. And we know that he is spending money every day at one of his clubs, at his hotel. He spends his personal money. He spends the government money because he goes there with large Secret Service contingents. He gets a lot of money from political committees, politicians, all of whom they know that they have to patronize him because everybody knows he's paying attention, right? Everybody knows. The president of Ukraine knows. In that infamous phone call, the president of Ukraine said, I've stayed at the Trump hotels, which you may have forgotten, but it is a worldwide message. It is understood. Everybody around the world, rich people, political leaders understand that to curry favor with Trump, to get his attention, or even just to have a normal negotiation with him, you have to patronize his businesses. And that is the structure that we have set up. And one of the reasons that I call my book American Oligarchs is because it allows such an ability for corruption. This is something that the founders were really worried about. They were sort of like, human desire is going to be what it is, and you can't regulate human desire. So, but what you can do is you can set up structures that will limit the ways that people can act on their temptations. And what has happened, particularly in the last 50 years or so, and particularly in the 10 years since Citizens United, which was decided 10 years ago yesterday, in that period, it's been so easy for very, very, very wealthy people to contribute to politics that it both created the way for Trump and the brand of politics that he practices, and also created a system where as president, he has made it easier and easier and easier for the very wealthy, or maybe even not so wealthy people like Lev Parnas can give him a lot of money and get something from him. And that has become standard operating procedure in our government. And it is been very difficult to fight against because, I mean, there have been a number of lawsuits that are all just sort of tied up. Many of them are going to the Supreme Court, but Trump is so litigious that it is very, very, very hard to get him to play by the rules. So he is, even in this situation where he has announced, I'm going to do this thing, he's just sort of doing literally whatever he wants. I mean, he said, I'm going to give up day-to-day control, but he's not really doing that. He's not really even doing the minimal things he promised. And when people try to call him to account, district attorneys, attorneys general, congressional investigators, he fights them in court. And they get tied up in the court. I mean, for example, I've been covering the case of Trump v. Vance, which is the Manhattan district attorney wants to investigate Trump's business practices stemming from the Stormy Daniels case. So what happened very quickly, what their theory is that when Donald Trump paid the hush money to Stormy Daniels, they declared that as a retainer fee for Michael Cohen, but it wasn't actually a retainer fee, so that is falsifying a business record, which is a felony in New York. So the DA is trying to investigate this, and Trump has sued. And it went to a federal judge, and the federal judge I was in the courtroom. He was like, listen to the arguments, and he said, I'm ruling right now. He's like, no, you have to turn over these records. This is not right. And it went to the Second Circuit, and Trump lost in the Second Circuit in a very, very strong decision. And so he is appealing it to the Supreme Court. So it's going to be heard in the Supreme Court March 20th. It won't be decided until June. And all of this time, the district attorney is being prevented from even investigating the president. So this is not indicting. This is not anything. This is just investigating. And it is Trump's mastery of those levers of power that have really left him believing, and I think we can all tell, acting as if the laws of gravity do not apply to him.
You mentioned at the start of our conversation your motivations for writing the book, but I want to take that a little bit further. We're in a time where truth and facts are being questioned, and there's a passage at the end of your book that says, quote, "The act of writing the story itself is an action, a chance, a tilt toward the future." Is that really what the book is? I mean, it's perhaps not the bending of the current, but really a matter of record. Matter of that we will look back at this time in history and say, Andrea wrote something.
I wrote a thing. I mean, and a lot. I mean, I'm not the only one.
In all of those, exactly.
Right. But I do feel like, so writing this book was really, really hard. And it's my first book, so I didn't actually really realize how hard it was going to be. And the whole time, I have been co-hosting and working on this podcast, Trump Inc. And by the way, I do want to shout out to Jim Schachter, who is the head of all of New Hampshire Public Radio, but who was the news director at WNYC, who I have many good things to say about Jim. But one of the good things I'll say is when we found out that Paul Manafort was laundering money, there was maybe a little queasiness about us saying that because, like, we didn't really have definitive proof. We just had a bunch of experts saying, like, yeah, this looks like money laundering. And Jim was like, no, do that story. And then months later, Paul Manafort was indicted for money laundering, and he is now in prison serving after being convicted in 2 jurisdictions. So thank you, Jim Schachter, for supporting that journalism. But the work has been really, really hard. And it's been doing the podcast and writing the book has been intense. And a lot of people have said to me along the way, why are you bothering? What's it going to do? Like, you know, and then a lot of people are like, well, is Trump going to be held to account? And I hope so, because I believe in consequences, but that's not why I'm doing what I'm doing. The reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is because the story needs to be told. It needs to be documented. And truth is so under assault now. The 16,000 lies a day thing is real. I mean, you know, I've covered politics for a long time. All politicians lie. But mostly they're ashamed about lying. So, I covered Chris Christie for like 4 years. I wrote about Bridgegate, and like he spoke in a way that like we couldn't actually catch him in a specific lie. It was very hard, and we spent a lot of time like saying, okay, like we know he's lying because we've lined all these things up. But Trump is like, yeah, sure, I'm lying. It's just a way for him to show his power. And the way to show power against that is to say, like, okay, we know there is such a thing as truth, and we are going to carve out a space. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect. That doesn't mean everything's right about it. But once you stop believing that there is a common truth, then you have all kinds of horrible consequences. And one of the people I quote at the end of the book is Hannah Arendt. My father is a Hannah Arendt scholar, so I said to him, Dad, can you help me find a good quote from Hannah Arendt? Because he's a scholar, he's like, read these 7 books.
Yeah.
But then finally he sent me an article from The New Yorker, and that she wrote on truth in politics in the 1960s, in which she confronts this very issue. It's not just that one side is right and one side is wrong. It's that once the very notion of truth becomes eroded, you cannot have a politics, you cannot have a collective life. And that is what I felt was really important to do, and why I feel like writing this book was an ultimately hopeful project, because if I'd given up hope, I wouldn't be doing it.
Andrea, thank you so much for your work.
Thank you so much.
I want to now open the questions up for the audience. And we have Mike, this tall gentleman here. Alex has the mic. Just raise your hand and he will come to you. Yes, we'll start with the gentleman in the back and then we'll come to you in the front.
Hi. At the beginning, you said that Jared Kushner has become one of the most powerful men in America. So I'm curious, what is the source of Jared Kushner's power? How would you describe it, other than that he's the president's son-in-law? Is there more to it than that?
Well, I think that's very, very important. I mean, he comes from a family that prized family loyalty, and he married into a family that prized family loyalty. And if you look at the way Trump organizes the White House, it's family above everything. So that is not inconsequential. And it gives him a sort of immunity. I mean, you think about the people that have left. Reince Priebus, John Kelly, Jim Mattis, H.R. McMaster, Mike Flynn, John Bolton, on and on and on. All of these people, many of them generals, have just left through the White House. And there is Jared Kushner, his daughter's son, who is in this position where not only is he in a very powerful position, but he's in a very proximate position. So whoever can make their argument in a cabinet meeting, and then Jared Kushner can go to the family dinner and say what he wants. And with Trump, proximity is power and family is power. And as long as Jared Kushner is married to Ivanka Trump, and I have no reason to believe it won't be a long marriage, Jared Kushner will be close to Donald Trump.
Great question. Yes.
Hi, thank you. So I'm wondering, have you been threatened with litigation with your book and
Oh, yeah.
podcast, or actually other threats? I'm
Oh, yes.
a bit concerned about your safety. I don't know if it's been an
I
issue.
have definitely been threatened with litigation, but the truth is a defense. So one of the things that I worked really, really hard on in the book was making sure that I was telling the truth, which doesn't mean like every tiny little thing is going to be absolutely correct. I mean, one of the things that I learned in writing a book is if you talk to 7 people about something that happened 20 years ago, you have to just make a judgment about what is the right thing. But I've read all of the documents and I've spoken to all of the people that I can, and I am satisfied that what I am writing is the truth. So, I mean, it is a scary thing, and it was scary. I spoke to maybe more than 200 people in writing this book, and maybe 10 of them said, you can use my name. And it was, people were very scared. People had been sued themselves. People had signed non-disclosure agreements. People were just scared because they see what happens when you cross Donald Trump. I mean, it's obvious. Every day we can see that he bullies people or he tweets about them. So even people that said to me, Donald Trump is my friend, or Ivanka Trump, or Jared Kushner, or so-and-so and so-and-so is my friend, I'm like, I don't want the trouble. So you cannot use my name because I don't want to cross them. So it was really hard to speak to all of these people who had these very emotional experiences and also hear from lawyers. And I read about a lot of oligarchs in the book. So I heard from a lot of lawyers of oligarchs. The final night I was fact-checking my book, I got a letter at 10:30 in the evening from Oleg Deripaska, who is a Russian oligarch's lawyer. Yes. So, but, I felt like, okay, I'm writing the truth. I'm writing it's right. So they can threaten me, but you're still allowed to write the truth as a journalist.
Now that the book is out, have you received
I have not.
threats or
I have
anything?
not received. I mean, I just mute people on Twitter who say nasty things.
Yeah.
But not that I know of.
Other questions? I'll take yours, and then I'll take yours here.
How has Trump managed to avoid prison or jail time? And
Okay, so
do you think that's-
definitely read the book. Because I mean, there's a lot of it in the book. There's a lot of different ways. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, but these are just two. So in Donald Trump's very first deal to become a Manhattan real estate developer, he wanted to acquire some land from Penn Central, the railroad that was becoming bankrupt. And he was this 29-year-old untested developer, and the judge was skeptical. And there was some resistance. And then in the middle of this litigation, the lawyer for the other side turns around and says, I support Donald Trump. So he was investigated for perhaps making some kind of shady deal with that lawyer to turn him. No charges were filed, but in the course of the investigation, Donald Trump's lawyer, Roy Cohn, who's a name you might recognize, said, why don't you just meet with the FBI agent without anybody present? So he meets with the FBI agent with his young and beautiful wife, Ivana, and his toddler son, Don Jr., in his father's office on Avenue Z, and the agent is charmed, and no charges are filed. So this is a pattern with Donald Trump. There are many, many places where he would forge alliances with FBI agents, take them to dinner, take them in his helicopter, play a round of golf with them. U.S. attorneys, he would take Chris Christie to lunch. He gave to the favorite charity of the Manhattan district attorney. His father, Fred, gave a whole bunch of money to the Brooklyn Democratic Party, which controlled the Brooklyn district attorney, which meant some of the things that I was talking about with the Senate Banking Committee were never investigated. There was a story that we did with ProPublica and The New Yorker about Ivanka Trump Jr. and Donald Trump and how they were under investigation by the Manhattan DA, the same one that's trying again to investigate him now. But anyway, they were under investigation prior to when Trump was president, and during the course of this investigation, one of the DA's very largest donors, who was Trump's personal attorney, Mark Kasowitz, has a meeting with the DA, and then the charges go away. So there's a lot of ways. I mean, I think that we can all see the ways that Donald Trump brings people close to them and then uses that to exercise his power. And that is something that he very much did as a private businessman, and he does it as president. And you can read about in the Mueller report all the many, many ways as president that he kept himself from being investigated and called to account. Also, he sues. Yeah. So the sheer sort of energy and volume of all his litigation sort of quashes, in many cases, legal consequences because people just don't want the trouble.
Yeah, the cumulative is
but read the book.
And reading the book, it really is. There was a gentleman here who had a question.
I've read speculation that Trump has benefited from money laundering. I recall stories about a mansion in Florida that was sold. So I wonder what evidence you've come across and of his direct involvement or profiting from money laundering.
Yeah, well, he certainly
how that would work.
had business partners who were money launderers, without a doubt. The Florida mansion is a bit of an uncertain situation. This was a mansion that he bought right around the time he bought it just before the financial crisis and then sold it to a Russian for many tens of millions of dollars more than he had paid for it. And there was a question, what was that? The sort of largest set of questions around Trump and money laundering have centered around a set of loans that he got for his Doral golf course and also for the old post office in Washington, D.C. from Deutsche Bank. And the House actually issued a subpoena, and they said, we want to know if there's money laundering here, and we want to look at all of these different accounts of Donald Trump and his children, because this is how money laundering is done, and we want to look at related limited liability companies. And I think you probably know by now what happened with that, which is that he sued Trump v. Deutsche Bank, which was the second time he sued Deutsche Bank. And because Deutsche Bank was actually going to turn over the records after the House subpoenaed them, and he lost that case at the district level, and then he appealed it, and he lost it at the Second Circuit, and he appealed it, and it's now going to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes, question here.
Andrea, in the annals of shamelessness, the combination of
This is Jim Schachter, by the way.
Yes.
the combination of President Trump and Mayor Giuliani seems like that.
Oh my God.
And it's the thing that brings us right to what's going on
Yeah.
tonight in the Senate. Is there some insight you can offer illuminating the nature of that relationship, the danger it poses, things we ought to be watching for?
Yes.
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things. The epigraph of my book comes from Charlie Kushner, and it says, no human being could write this script, only God could write this script. And one of the things that I kept finding as I was writing it is that the characters came back around and the storylines came back around. So when I started writing this book in the summer of 2018, it was actually during Paul Manafort's trial. And I talk about the experience of going to look at one of his brownstones in Brooklyn, which was very close to where I live, and not understanding at the time that I saw it that it had been paid for with oligarchic wealth from Ukraine. So that was on the page 1 of the introduction. And I didn't know when I wrote that we'd be here now talking about Ukrainian oligarchs and money flowing into the United States, and yet we are. Same for Rudy Giuliani. He is a character in the early part of the book, and I actually, as I was finishing writing the book, had to sort of write more about the later Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani, as this crusading U.S. attorney, was somebody who was a complicated character, as many people are, because he was genuinely able to speak about the harms of corruption, which many people cannot. He was able to articulate how it corroded the life of a city, and it hurt people, and it took money away from social good. But he was also always what we see now, which is a sort of very bombastic person who liked attention. And Trump came to understand how to flatter that. He gave Rudy Giuliani money. While Rudy Giuliani was mayor, he hired the lobbying firm closest to Rudy Giuliani so that he could build his tower across from the UN, extra tall. He sort of cultivated Rudy Giuliani in a variety of ways while Rudy Giuliani was mayor. But then, after Rudy Giuliani's own presidential campaign crashed, he was sort of out of it. And Rudy Giuliani found a new life in the Trump 2016 campaign. He found that he could get many of the things that he had wanted, which were attention and also money, because people were suddenly interested in hiring him again, especially right after the election when they saw his connections to Trump. And it's sort of become this vortex of activity. I mean, Rudy Giuliani has literally set up a shingle at the Trump Hotel in Washington, and people see him there and understand he has proximity to the president, and then they hire him. And that is his business model. It's in some ways he's selling his name like Trump sells his name. Mm-hmm. So they were both sort of in this parallel tracks, both seeking attention, both sort of selling their names, and both believing that the rules did not apply to them. And I think you can really see that in many of the things that are coming out in the impeachment hearings about how Rudy Giuliani just believes he is on the side of right, and everything he has done is right because he has done it, which is something very Trumpian in their thinking. It's amazing to me that these two New York characters are at the center of this international geopolitical drama. Just as an aside, I did a story for NPR about Rudy Giuliani through the ages or something like that. I used all this tape of Rudy Giuliani. It was right when all of this stuff was coming out. And the editor at NPR said, well, you can use this for his obituary whenever he dies. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I've been covering Rudy Giuliani since 1994, and I have to cover him till he dies? Apparently so. Not that I wish him any ill health or that he is on the verge of death, but it's just I seem to be bound with him until death do us part.
We have a question in the front here.
I was curious so through our history, right, there's always been these big money, Carnegies and Mellons and, Rockefellers. But has there ever been a time when these families have merged together, like the Kushners and the Trumps? And why?
Well,
how does that happen?
I'm sure yes. I mean, I think, one of the things that I talk about in the book is how, wealth has always been a part of American politics and American life, but the last time where we had the kind of economic inequality we do now was the Gilded Age. And there was a response to the Gilded Age. So the John D. Rockefeller's company was broken up. And there were laws to make the system more democratic, and an income tax was imposed. So there were a number of, so when we got to the brink the last time, there were measures put in to sort of pull us back from the brink. So there are always very wealthy families in American politics, then as now. The question is, what structures do we have in place to balance that power out with everything else? And what has happened in recent years is that we have fewer and fewer structures to prevent both the inequality of wealth and to prevent very wealthy people from sort of just putting their money into the political system to get the outcomes that they want. And you also have this situation where you have these families like the Trumps who are just willing to shamelessly use the system to their own ends. So I think that what we're seeing now is the sort of historical confluence of those two things. I mean, Donald Trump is certainly not one of the richest people in America. He's not like the Koch brothers. But he has always believed that he can turn his money into political power. And now as president, he is in the situation of allowing everybody else to do that in enormous ways. I mean, at the time that they were married, I don't think anybody knew what was coming. So, I mean, the Kennedys and the Cuomos got married. I mean, there's a lot of sort of big family marriages like this, of which I am not an expert. I'm sure it's not the first time. I just think it was a very consequential time, which is why I started the book out with the wedding.
Do any of the Trump children, meaning Ivanka, Donald Jr., have political aspirations?
Apparently, yes.
Yes, we hear this about Ivanka.
I have been hearing that there's been a sort of floating of, Ivanka Trump for 2024. But, this is, I haven't reported out the seriousness of that, so I don't want to vouch for whether that's really going to happen. I mean, I do think that, following Ivanka Trump closely as I have, she acts in a way that people who are protecting their political futures act. So she speaks very, very carefully. She talks about families. Most of the time when she talks about her father, she talks about things like the economy and her story of, we're living in a great economy, isn't it wonderful? For the most part, you don't see her participating in the kind of attacks that her father or her brother Don Jr. do.
Yes. Yes, question behind you.
So I've been listening to Trumping since the beginning, and it's great.
Oh, thank you.
It's been super. My question is said with a little bit of humor, but sincerely. How do you envision the Trump library to be when he's after his president? I mean, what would be in there?
Well, I hope there is one. I don't know. A lot of court records? I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's been a challenge of covering Trump is that it's a privately held company, so we get what we get. It's not like there are shareholders and a board and a system of reporting, mostly. I mean, he had that in his casinos, but mostly not. So the answer is we're not entirely sure what is going to be left behind. Although, Obama sort of is privatizing his archives, which I think is a dangerous precedent. Archives should belong to the people. It's the nation's history. It doesn't belong to a person. And I think one of the things that is concerning about that is he's created a place where, Trump can privatize his archives, and you can just imagine what that would be.
Mm-hmm. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Here.
In the beginning of Trump's exposure to the world, we learned a little bit about the Christopher Steele papers, and that seems to have immediately gone underground. That is, we heard about it. There were some random stories about what went on, and then it just disappeared. Can you discuss that at all?
Well, I think that the sort of veracity of that sheaf of papers in particular, I think that it has been part of our political life. A lot of what Robert Mueller looked at was related to sort of themes that were in that dossier, as it's called. And there are a lot of names in that dossier that show up in the Mueller report. I mean, Paul Manafort is a big one. Michael Cohen is in there. Viktor Yanukovych, who was the corrupt former president of Ukraine, is in there. Obviously, Vladimir Putin. So the idea that there was this kind of flow of information from the Russians to the Trump campaign, we understand that happened. The specific details, and if you're thinking about the P-tape detail, has never been confirmed. But even the people
who don't know.
People know what the P-tape is, right?
I don't think everyone
No,
does.
people don't know what the P-tape is? Oh, sorry. So one of the things that came up at the same press conference where Trump said, I have a no conflict situation, was raised that there was this dossier of information that had been gathered by people who were working for the Hillary Clinton campaign. But one of the things, a gentleman named Christopher Steele, who had worked for who had been basically the chief British spy in Moscow, had his own company and was investigating through human sources. And what had happened was that the Democrats had hired this firm called Fusion GPS, and they were ex-journalists who did a lot of, ex-business journalists that did a lot of business investigations. And they looked at all the paperwork. Like us, they hit a wall because there's only so much you can get from the paperwork. So they hired Chris Steele to get human intelligence. And they gave him a lot of information about contacts between the Trump campaign and various people in Russia, many of which actually proved to be true, even though Mueller didn't choose to find any wrongdoing on that front. But that doesn't mean the things didn't happen. So there was this set of information being spread. But one of the things that was in the dossier was that Trump had stayed at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel and had hired a set of prostitutes to pee on the bed that Barack and Michelle Obama had stayed at when they stayed at the whole hotel. So that is the P-tape story, and that has never been verified. But one of the things that they were saying is, does the Russian government have something on Donald Trump? Well, the Russian government did have something on Donald Trump. The thing that the Russian government had on Donald Trump was not the P-tape. The thing that Vladimir Putin knew that we didn't know was that Trump wanted to get a tower in Moscow, and that his people were going to the government of Moscow and asking the leaders of a hostile foreign power for the same things that Trump had always asked for: zoning variances and packages of land. And they were asking for favors during the campaign. So in the specific sense of, was there a P-tape? No evidence that there was a P-tape. Is there evidence that the Russian government had compromising or information that could potentially be compromising to Donald Trump? Yes, definitively. We know that.
Any other questions? Good questions that you all have. Yes, sir.
So this is a question about Jared Kushner's morality. You alluded earlier to the fact that he's from a modern Orthodox family. Now, in my experience, Judaism has a lot to say about ethics and morality. And you did an excellent job, a very clear explanation of his family's response to the Holocaust and how that differed from many other survivors' response to it. So I'm wondering, when, in your sense of, how is it he squares his actions with any sense of ethics and morality?
Yeah, it is a complicated thing, and it was complicated also for Jared Kushner's father, Charlie, who had a lot of rules around the household, like girls had to wear their hair in a certain way, and no one could dress in jeans, which he called dungarees. So there's a lot of that kind of rule, but then obviously breaking the big rules like evading taxes and violating campaign finance laws and entrapping his brother-in-law with a prostitute. So, I think there's sort of a sense of rules are for other people. And it is a very complicated and difficult to grapple with theme. So there are rules in your personal life that don't sort of apply more broadly in how you treat rules in the world.
Yeah.
And it is, there's a lot of themes of betrayal in the book, family betrayal, but also one of the things that was very interesting to me in reporting the book is something we were talking about how a lot of people felt like, especially Jared and Ivanka, were sort of part of the New York life and felt very, very, very betrayed when Jared went to the White House and started making decisions that they didn't feel like were really in sync with New York values. And there were so many people who really expressed to me a sense of betrayal. Who is this person that has gone on to do these things that is not the person that I thought was my friend or that I knew or that I had seen at dinners or that was involved in the civic life of New York?
In fact, you write pretty extensively the manner of Jared, which we get to see when we see him speaking and the way his mannerisms, but a very genteel man who is thought of to be very respectful.
Very polite.
Very polite.
Yes.
But as you said earlier, over time, people started to see an evolution in him, something that was different, a strain that was different over time.
Right. Well, I think it's complicated because I think there is a sort of polite respectfulness, which you can see even now. But I think that, as Jared has felt more and more powerful, you see, for example, in his WhatsApp messages with MBS or his, other connections with the Saudis, a sense of, I'm a disruptor, you all are trying to make me do things the old way, and I came here to do things in a different way. And that, I think, has been quite shocking for people around him to see those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. I can take one more question. Does anyone have a question before we wrap up? Yes, we have a woman right up here in the front. We'll take, the mic is coming to you.
Hi, Andrea. I'm Beth's friend, actually, by the
Oh,
way.
hi.
But hi. So what's, one day there will be a time without Donald Trump. What's his next ambition? What would be next for him?
Well, he's not a New York resident. He moved to Florida. I don't know the answer, and I think that, and I don't know that he knows the answer except to acquire the things that he wants, which is sort of attention and respect and money and power, which has always driven him and drives him in the White House, and I would imagine would drive him in his life after the White House as well. One of the things that's very interesting about the Ukraine thing is that the Trump behaviors are so familiar, the way that he's compromising people and breaking systems and going through his own channels to set up diplomacy and using the Department of Defense and the Department of Budget and the Department of State to his own ends. But the end is not maybe what I would have expected when we started reporting on Trump's business many years ago. It's not just to put money into his own pocket, it's to enhance his power, which is a sort of different kind of corruption than just personal profit, but I think one that we can see also has very serious consequences.
Yeah. I just have to say, on a personal note, and I think many of us feel this way, it's just astonishing to know that Trump he's been a part of our lives for so long and a part of our consciousness for so long, and all for what you were saying, this idea of resonance with people and power and a sense of and so in reading your book, one thing that also became clear to me is just how long he had been grooming us, the public, for the idea that he could be president.
Yes. He, since the last century, he's been talking about it, and and taking himself much more seriously, we should have probably paid more attention, which is something that I actually get into in the prologue of the book. But let me just say a couple of other things before we break up, which is that I really wanted to write a book that would be read and that people would like to read from beginning to end, and that tells a story. I cut out a lot of things because I didn't want to clutter up the narrative. So I hope you read it. And I hope that even if you have a copy, you get one for friends, because I feel like one of the things that's very important is I feel like, okay, I want to be standing up for truth, but I want it to exist. I did just get, right before I walked in the door here tonight, the very good news that I have hit the New York Times bestseller list.
Oh, congratulations.
So that's an exciting, I can say the rest of my life, I'm a New York Times bestselling author. When I was when Jane Mayer, who many of you know from The New Yorker, blurbed my book, and they put Jane Mayer, New York Times bestselling author, and I was like, Jane Mayer works for The New Yorker. That's the most important thing? Apparently that's the most important thing. So please enjoy the book. Please follow me on Twitter and DM me what you think and DM me questions. Please subscribe to the podcast Trump Inc. The last 2 episodes are derived from the book, but I made special attention in bringing new sound elements, so I think that you will like listening to them. And there are people I know who say, I know you're here, so none of you think this, but there are people who say, oh my God, I can't really even think about this anymore. What I'm trying to do is to tell a story in a way that will make people feel empowered. So I hope that you feel that way when you read this book. And thank you for coming.
Andrea Weinstein, thank you so much.